The Nutcracker and the Mouse King. It was Christmas Eve. Marie and Fritz sat cuddled together in a corner of the back parlour, for they had not been permitted during the whole day to go even into the small drawing room, much less into the best drawing room into which it opened. The deep evening twilight had come, and they began to feel almost afraid. Seeing that no Christmas candles were brought in, Fritz whispered to his sister Marie, who was just 7, that he had heard rattlings and rustlings going on all day in the closed room, as well as distant hammerings, and that not long before, a little dark-looking man with a big box under his arm had gone slipping and creeping across the floor. He well knew that this little man was no other than Godfather Drosselmeyer. At this news, Marie clapped her little hands for gladness and cried, "Oh, I do wonder what pretty things Godfather Drosselmeyer has been making for us this time." Godfather Drosselmeyer was anything but a nice-looking man. He was little and lean, with a great many wrinkles on his face and a big patch of black plaster over his right eye, and not a hair on his head. He wore a fine white wig made of glass, but he was a very, very clever man, for he knew and understood all about clocks and watches, and could make them himself. So, when one of the beautiful clocks in Fritz and Marie's home was out of sorts and couldn't sing, Godfather Drosselmeyer would come, take off his glass periwig and his little yellow coat, put on a blue apron and begin to stick sharp pointed instruments into the inside of the clock. Of course, whenever he came, he always brought something delightful in his pockets for Marie and Fritz. Perhaps a little man who could roll his eyes and make bows and scrapes most comic to behold, or a box out of which a little bird would jump. But for Christmas time, he had invariably prepared some especially wonderful invention. "Oh, what can Godfather Drosselmeyer have been making for us this time?" Marie said again. "I'm sure this time," said Fritz, "it must be a great castle, a fortress, where all sorts of pretty soldiers are drilling and marching about. Then other soldiers come to try and get into the fortress, upon which the soldiers inside fire away at them with cannon, until everything bangs and thunders like anything." "No, no," said Marie. "Godfather Drosselmeyer once told me about a beautiful garden with a lake in it, and beautiful swans swimming about with great gold collars, singing lovely music. And then a lovely little girl comes down through the garden to the lake, and calls the swans, and feeds them with shortbread and cake." "Swans don't eat cake and shortbread," Fritz cried, "and Godfather Drosselmeyer couldn't make a whole garden." The children went on trying to guess what he might have in store for them this time. Marie told Fritz that her biggest doll had altered very much. She was more clumsy and awkward than ever, for she tumbled onto the floor every 2 or 3 minutes. Fritz said that a good fox was lacking in his collection of animals, and that his army of soldiers was quite without a cavalry, as his papa well knew. But the children knew that their elders had all sorts of charming things ready for them. They remembered, too, that the Christ child at Christmas time took special care of their wants, and knew best what gift would bring them true happiness. Marie sat in thoughtful silence, but Fritz murmured quietly to himself, "But for all that, I do want a fox and some hussars." It was now quite dark. Fritz and Marie, sitting close together, did not dare to utter another word. They felt as if there were a fluttering of gentle, unseen wings around them, while a very far-away music could be heard. Then a bright gleam of light passed quickly across the wall, and the children knew that the Christ child was being borne away on shining clouds to other happy children. At this moment a silvery bell rang out, cling-a-ling-a-cling-a-ling. The doors flew open, and a brilliant light came streaming from the drawing-room. "Oh, oh!" cried the children, clapping their hands. But Papa and Mamma came and took their hands, saying, "Come now, darlings, and see what the blessed Christ child has brought for you." The two children stood speechless, with brilliant glances fixed on all the beautiful things before them. After a while, Marie, with a sigh, cried, "Oh, how lovely! How lovely!" And Fritz gave several jumps of delight. The children had certainly been very, very good, for never had so many beautiful and delightful things been provided for them as at this Christmas. The great Christmas tree on the table bore many apples of silver and gold, and all its branches were heavy with bourdon blossom, consisting of sugar almonds, many tinted bonbons, and all sorts of charming things to eat. In all the recesses of its branches, hundreds of little tapers glittered like stars. How many beautiful things there were! Marie gazed at the loveliest dolls and all kinds of toys, and a little silk dress with many tinted ribbons hung from a projecting branch. "Oh, the lovely, lovely dress!" she cried. Fritz, in the meantime, had had 2 or 3 trials around the table to see how his new fox could gallop. "I believe it's a wild beast," he said, "but that's no matter. I can frighten him already." He set to work to muster his new hussars, well equipped in red and gold uniforms with real silver swords, and mounted on such shining white horses that you would have thought them of pure silver. When the children had become a little quieter, there came another tinkling of a bell, and they knew that Godfather Drosselmeyer would show them his Christmas presents, which were on another table against the wall, concealed by a curtain. When this curtain was drawn, what did the children behold? On a green lawn, bright with flowers, stood a beautiful castle with a great many shining windows and golden towers. A chime of bells was going on inside it, doors and windows opened, and you saw very small ladies and gentlemen with plumed hats and long robes walking up and down in the rooms. Fritz stood looking at the beautiful castle, his arms leaning upon the table. In a little while he said, "Godfather Drosselmeyer, let me go into your castle." "This cannot be done, little Fritz," was his answer. "The castle is not as tall as yourself, golden towers and all." "Well, then make the man with the green cloak, who is always looking from the window, walk about with the others." "And that can't be done either," said his godfather once more. "It can't be altered, you know." "Oh," said Fritz, "it can't be done? Very well, if your little creatures in the castle can only always do the same thing, they're not very much." So he went back to his Christmas table to play with his hussars. Marie, too, was soon tired of the little castle people, though she did not like to show it as her brother did. At last, however, she also crept back to the table where the Christmas presents were laid out, but she had just noticed there among Fritz's soldiers an excellent little man, standing still and modest as if he were waiting patiently until someone should notice him. In regard to his appearance, there was much that was objectionable, for his body was rather too tall and stout for his little thin legs, and his head was a great deal too large. But the elegance of the little gentleman's costume showed him to be a person of taste and cultivation. He had on a very pretty violet hussar's jacket, and the loveliest little boots ever seen. It was certainly funny that, dressed in such style as he was, he wore a rather absurd short cloak on his shoulders, which looked as if it were made of wood, and on his head he wore a miner's cap. Nevertheless, as Marie kept looking at this little man, she saw more and more clearly what a sweet disposition was legible on his countenance. His green eyes spoke only kindness, and the nicely curled white cotton beard on his chin drew attention to the sweet smile which his bright lips always expressed.
"Oh, Papa, dear!"
cried Marie at last.
"Whose is that most darling little man beside the tree?"
"That little fellow, my dear, will work hard for you all. He's going to crack nuts for you." With that, Marie's father took him from the table, and when he raised the wooden cloak, the little man opened his mouth. Marie put in a nut, and with a crack, the little man bit it in pieces. He had to crack a great many nuts. Marie picked out the smallest ones, but Fritz gave him all the biggest and hardest nuts he could find. But all at once there was a crack, crack, and 3 little teeth fell out of Nutcracker's mouth, and his chin became loose and shaky.
"Ah, my poor Nutcracker!"
Marie cried as she gathered up the lost teeth, bound a pretty white ribbon about his poor chin, and wrapped the poor little fellow tenderly in her handkerchief. In this way she held him, rocking him like a child in her arms, as she looked at her picture books. Marie and Fritz were allowed to keep their playthings in the glass cupboard in the sitting room. Fritz soon tired of playing with his hussars and placed them on the upper shelf, and Marie put her dolls in the beautiful dolls' room on the lower shelf. It had become almost midnight, and their mother had aroused the children to go to bed. Fritz obeyed, but Marie begged for just a little while longer, saying she had such a number of things to see to, and promising that as soon as ever she had got them all settled, she would go to bed at once. Marie was a good girl, and her mother allowed her to remain a little longer with her toys, but fearing lest Marie should be too much occupied with her new doll and other playthings to think of the lights, her mother put all of them out, leaving only the lamp which hung from the ceiling, and which shed a soft light over everything. As soon as Marie was alone, she carefully unbound the ribbon around Nutcracker's head, and examined his wounds.
"Oh, my darling Nutcracker," she said, "I'll take the best care of you, for I am really fond of you. Your teeth shall be put back and your shoulder made right again."
She took him in her arms again, went to the cupboard, and said to her new doll,
"Clara, you will give up your bed to this poor sick wounded Nutcracker, I'm sure?"
Miss Clara, in her Christmas dress, looked very disdainful, but Marie took the bed and moved it forward, laid Nutcracker carefully upon it, and placed them on the upper shelf near the village in which Fritz's hussars were resting. She was about to close the cupboard door when, hark! There began a low, soft rustling and rattling all around, behind the stove, under the chairs, behind the cupboards. The clock on the wall warned louder and louder, but it could not strike. Marie looked at it, and saw that the big gilt owl which was on the top had drooped its wings so that they covered the whole of the clock, and the warning of the clock kept growing louder and louder, with distinct words, "Clock stop ticking, mousy king's ears are fine, purr, purr, only sing, poom, poom, bells go chime, soon rings out the fated time." Marie grew terribly frightened, and was going to rush away as quickly as she could when she noticed that Godfather Drosselmeyer was up on top of the clock instead of the owl.
"Godfather Drosselmeyer!"
she called out as soon as she composed herself.
"What are you doing up there, you naughty, naughty godfather?"
But then there began a strange scampering and squeaking everywhere all about, and presently there was a sound of running and trotting as of thousands of little feet behind the walls, and at the same time thousands of little lights began to glitter out between the chinks of the woodwork. But they were not lights. No, no. Little glittering eyes. And Marie said that everywhere mice were peeping and squeezing themselves out through every chink. Presently they were trotting and galloping in all directions all over the room. Marie was not afraid of mice, and she could not help being amused by this sight. She stood watching the mice come from all directions, when suddenly there came a sharp and terrible piping noise, and 7 mouse heads, with 7 shining crowns upon them, rose through the floor, and behind them wriggled a mouse's body, on which the 7 heads had all grown. Then the whole army of mice shouted in full chorus and went trot, 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 right up to the cupboard. In fact, to Marie, who was standing beside it. Half frightened, Marie leaned back against the cupboard door, and there was a klirr, klirr, klirr. What was happening? Right behind Marie a movement seemed to commence in the cupboard, and small faint voices began to be heard, saying, "Come awake, measures take, out to the fight, out to the fight, shield the right, arm and away, this is the night." And bells began ringing as prettily as you please.
"Oh, that's my little peal of bells,"
cried Marie, and she went nearer and looked in. Then she saw that there was a bright light in the cupboard, and everything there was astir. Dolls and little figures of all kinds were running about together and struggling with their little arms. All at once, Nutcracker rose from his bed, cast off the bedclothes, and sprang with both feet to the floor of the shelf, calling out, "Nick, nack, knack, stupid mousy pack, crick, crack, whack, hew, hick, and hack." And with this he drew his little sword, waved it in the air, and cried, "My trusty followers, are you ready to stand by me in the battle?" Instantly, 3 clowns, 1 pantaloon, 4 chimney sweeps, and a drummer cried, "Yes, yes, we follow you, Nutcracker." And then they threw themselves down from the upper shelf after the brave Nutcracker.
"But what is going to happen now?"
thought Marie. At this moment Nutcracker sprang down, and the squeaking and piping commenced again worse than ever. Under the big table, the mouse army was massed under the command of the terrible Mouse King. What was to be the result? "Beat the generale, drummer!" called out Nutcracker. Immediately the drummer began to roll his drum in the most splendid style, so that the window of the glass cupboard rattled and resounded. Then there began a cracking and a clattering inside, and Marie saw all the lids of the boxes in which Fritz's army was quartered burst open, and the soldiers came out and jumped down to the bottom of the shelf, where they formed up in good order. Nutcracker hurried up and down the ranks, speaking words of encouragement. Then, turning to Pantaloon, who was looking rather pale and wobbling his long chin, he said, "I know you are a brave and experienced general. I entrust you, Pantaloon, with the command of the cavalry and artillery,
You can do without a horse. Your own legs are long and you can gallop as fast as is necessary. Do your duty." Immediately, Pantaloon put his long, lean fingers to his mouth and gave a piercing whistle that rang as if 100 little trumpets had been sounding lustily. Then there began a tramping and neighing in the cupboard, and Fritz's new glittering hussars marched out and came to a halt on the floor. They marched past Nutcracker by regiments, with flags flying and bands playing. Then they wheeled into line and formed at right angles to the march. And now boomed Fritz's cannon with a pum-pum-pum, shooting sugar plums constantly under the mice. Boom, boom again, and a fine fire of gingerbread nuts went into the enemy's ranks, scattering the mice in all directions. Still, the mice displayed continually more forces. Their little silver balls, which they delivered with great precision, went even inside the glass cupboard. You've no idea of the hurly-burly that went on. It went purr, purr, poof, piff, boom, baroom. Pantaloon had made several most brilliant cavalry charges, and covered himself with glory, but Fritz's hussars were pelted by the mice's silver balls, which made bad spots on their red waistcoats. This made them hesitate and hang back for a time. Pantaloon made them take ground to the left, and in the excitement of the moment, they all wheeled round and marched home to their quarters. "The reserves shall come out!" cried Nutcracker, who hoped that more troops would come out from the glass cupboard. And there did, in fact, advance some brown gingerbread men and women, with gilt faces, hats, and helmets, but they fought so clumsily that they never hit any of the mice, and soon knocked off the cap of Nutcracker himself. Poor Nutcracker was now hard pressed and closely surrounded by enemies. He tried to jump the bottom ledge of the cupboard, but his legs were not long enough. "A horse! A horse! My kingdom for a horse!" At that moment, 2 of the enemies seized him by his wondercloak, and the king of the mice went rushing up to him, squeaking in triumph. Marie could contain herself no longer. "Oh, my poor Nutcracker!" she sobbed. She took off her left shoe, without distinctly knowing what she was about, and threw it as hard as she could into the thick of the enemy, straight at the Mouse King. Instantly, everything vanished, and all was silence. But there stood Nutcracker, with his sword in his hand. He fell upon one knee and said, "It was you, and you only, dearest lady, who inspired me with knightly valour. To you alone I owe my life. If you will take the trouble to follow me for a few steps, what glorious and beautiful things I could show you. Oh, do come with me, dearest lady." "I will go with you, dear Nutcracker," said Marie. "But it mustn't be far, and must not be for long, because, you know, I haven't had any sleep yet." "Then we will go by the shortest way," said Nutcracker, "although it is perhaps the most difficult." He went on in front, followed by Marie, till he stopped before the big old wardrobe which stood in the hall. Marie was surprised to see that, though it was generally shut, the doors of it were now wide open. Her father's fur travelling cloak hung in front. Nutcracker climbed up this cloak by the edgings and trimmings, and got hold of the big tassel which was fastened at the back of it by a thick cord. He gave this tassel a tug, and a pretty little ladder of cedar wood let itself quickly down through one of the armholes of the cloak. "Step up that ladder, if you'll be so kind," said Nutcracker,
Marie did so. But as soon as she had gone up through the armhole and began to look out at the neck, a dazzling light came streaming onto her, and she found herself standing on a lovely, sweet-scented meadow, from which millions of sparks were streaming upward like the glitter of beautiful gems. "This is Candy Meadow, where we are now," said Nutcracker, "but we'll go in at that gate there." Marie looked up and saw a beautiful gateway on the meadow only a few steps off. It seemed to be made of white, brown, and raisin-coloured marble, but when she came close to it, she saw it was all of baked sugar almonds and raisins, which, as Nutcracker said when they were going through it, was the reason it was called Almond and Raisin Gate. Presently, the sweetest of odours came breathing round her, streaming from a beautiful little wood on both sides of the way. There was such a glittering and sparkling among the dark foliage that one could see all the gold and silver fruits hanging on the many-tinted stems, and these stems and branches were all ornamented and dressed up in ribbons and bunches of flowers. "Oh, how charming this is!" cried Marie. "This is Christmas Tree Wood," said Nutcracker. "Ah," said Marie, "if I only could stay for a little. Oh, it is so lovely." Nutcracker clapped his little hands, and immediately there appeared a number of little shepherds and shepherdesses, and hunters and huntresses, so white and delicate that you would have thought they were made of pure sugar, although they had been walking about in the wood. They brought a beautiful golden easy-chair for Marie, and invited her to take a seat. As soon as she did so, the shepherds and shepherdesses danced a pretty ballet, for which the hunters and huntresses played the music on their horns, and then they all disappeared amongst the thickets. "Had we not better go on a little farther?" asked Nutcracker. Marie stood up and followed Nutcracker, who was going on, leading the way. They walked by the side of a sweet babbling brook, which seemed to be what was giving out all the perfume which filled the wood. "This is Orange Brook," said Nutcracker, "but except for its sweet scent, it is nothing like as fine a water as the river Lemonade, a beautiful broad stream which falls, as this one does, into Almond Milk Sea." And indeed, Marie soon heard a louder splashing and rushing, and came in sight of the river Lemonade, which went rolling along in swelling waves of yellowish colour, between banks covered with herbage and underwood. A short distance farther, on the banks of this stream, stood a nice little village. The houses were all dark brown, with gilded roofs so gay that one might suppose that they were plastered over with lemon peel and shelled almonds. "That is Gingerbread Valley, on the Honey River," said Nutcracker. "It is known for the good looks of its people, but they are very short-tempered because they suffer so much from toothache. So we will not go there, nor indeed visit all the little towns and villages or country. Let us be off to the capital." He stepped quickly onwards, and Marie followed him until they came to a great lake which kept broadening and broadening out, wider and wider, and on which the loveliest swans, white as silver with colours of gold, were floating everywhere. Nutcracker clapped his little hands, and the waves of the lake began to sound louder and splash higher, and at once there came a large shell barge made of precious stones of every colour, and drawn by 2 dolphins with scales of gold. It carried her and Nutcracker over the lake. Oh, how beautiful it was when Marie went onward there over the waters in the shell-shaped barge, with the rose perfume breathing around her and the rosy waves splashing. But she could not restrain a cry of admiration and astonishment
as she now found herself all of a sudden before a castle, brightly lighted and splendid, with 100 beautiful towers. Here and there upon its walls were rich bouquets of violets, narcissus, tulips, and carnations. The great dome, as well as the roofs of the towers, were set all over with thousands of sparkling gold and silver stars. "Aha!" said Nutcracker. "Here we are at Marzipan Castle at last." Marie was lost in admiration of this magic palace. The fact did not escape her that the roof was wanting to one of the tallest towers, and that little men upon a scaffold of sticks of cinnamon were busy putting it on again. But before she had time to ask Nutcracker about this, beautiful music was heard, and out came 12 little pages with lighted clove sticks, which they held in their little hands as torches. After them came 4 ladies about the size of Marie's Christmas doll, but so gorgeously and brilliantly dressed that Marie saw in a moment that they could be nothing but princesses. They embraced Nutcracker most tenderly and cried at once, "Oh, dearest prince, beloved brother!" Nutcracker seemed deeply affected. Then he took Marie by the hand and said, "Here is the noble preserver of my life. Had she not thrown her slipper in the nick of time, I should have been captured by the enemy." Then they embraced Marie and said, "Ah, noble preserver of our beloved royal brother, come into the castle and rest yourself, while we prepare some food." Marie and Nutcracker were conducted into the castle, and while the princesses were setting forth a dainty repast, Nutcracker related the adventures of his fight with the Mouse King. He told how everything would have gone against him if Marie had not come to his rescue. During all this time, it seemed to Marie as if what Nutcracker was saying kept growing more and more indistinct, and going farther and farther away. Presently she saw a silver mistiness rising up all about, like clouds in which the princesses, the pages, Nutcracker, and she herself were floating. And a curious singing and buzzing and humming began, which seemed to die away in the distance. And then she seemed to be going up, 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 as if in waves constantly rising and swelling higher and higher, higher and higher and higher. And then came a prrrr, poof, and all was gone. That was a crash and a tumble. However, Marie opened her eyes, and lo and behold, there she was in her own bed. Of course, you see how it was. Marie, confounded and amazed by all the wonderful things she had seen, had fallen asleep at last in Marzipan Castle, and no doubt the princesses themselves had carried her home and put her most gently to bed. And there we have it. The Nutcracker and the Mouse King.
published in 1816 by Prussian author E.T.A. Hoffmann. The story was originally written in German, and this particular version that I've just read to you in English, of course, was actually a much condensed version of the original story. The original, although still quite short, is written over 14 chapters, which would have just been a little bit too much to include in this Advent calendar. This telling of the story was obviously still by far the longest story that we've had included for this Audiobook Advent Calendar series, but the Nutcracker was requested by a couple of you. I'd intended to read it last Christmas, maybe even the Christmas before that, so I just couldn't help include it this year. This particular shortened version was from a book titled Little Folks' Christmas Stories and Plays, edited by Ada M. Skinner, which I believe was published in 1915, and which contains about 30 Christmas stories. So if you're looking for some more Christmassy stories this year or sometime in the future, I can definitely recommend this little compilation. If you did enjoy this telling of the Nutcracker and the Mouse King, let me know. If this was popular, I will definitely consider reading an English translation of the full version of the story. And perhaps some of you out there are familiar with Alexandre Dumas's adaptation of the story, which I believe was actually used as the reference point for Tchaikovsky's incredible ballet, the Nutcracker, which I think in many ways is far more famous than this original Hoffmann story. But I really enjoyed delving in to the tale which started it all and which ended up being the inspiration of some of the most iconic, beautiful pieces of music probably ever written. So thank you so much for listening today. Thank you for all the comments on yesterday's story, The Gift of the Magi. I really enjoyed that one, and of course, as always, it's wonderful to see the happy Fox fans in the comments. You take care, and of course you're going to come back for the final day of the Advent calendar as we open door 24. Read to you soon.